Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Ash, how are you doing?
You know what? I'm all right. I feel like it's been a little while since I've co-hosted with you. I didn't do it last week, so pleased as ever to be
Well, I was
reunited.
keeping your introduction simple on purpose because I humiliated myself last Friday by introducing Aaron as my erstwhile colleague, which I thought just meant long-standing, distinguished. But someone in the comments pointed out I'm completely wrong. You've done an English literature degree. Why was I incorrect there, Ash?
Erstwhile means former.
Exactly.
So if you were talking about, I don't know, Emma Barnett, you would be like the erstwhile presenter of Women's Hour, now turned Today programme.
100,000 people have watched that show now. And they've seen that I got a word completely wrong because I was trying to be fancier than I needed to be. And it's just completely egg on my face. Anyway, I hope the audience forgives me. I will only use short, ordinary words unless I've Googled them beforehand to avoid other similar hiccups. On tonight's show, I speak to Isabella Weber about anti-fascist economics. We spoke about her on Friday. Now I've got her on the show. We'll discuss more from the anti-woke backlash after Donald Trump's victory. Everyone in the Democratic Party is really arguing, and that does have implications for us because they're the superpower. Our discourse does follow American discourse to a large degree. And we'll end the show by talking about the infuriating media gaslighting over violence in Amsterdam. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, is under growing pressure to resign the most senior post in the Church of England. That's after he was implicated in a cover-up of horrific abuse of boys and young men in the Church of England. The scandal concerns the barrister and evangelical Christian John Smythe QC, who was an acquaintance of Welby's. Smythe met young boys throughout the 70s and 80s at a Christian camp. From there, he would take them to a garden shed at his Winchester home, where he carried out lashings with a cane. In 2017, Channel 4's Kathy Newman confronted the abuser.
Mr. Smythe, Kathy Newman from Channel 4 News. We're told that you beat young men until they bled. Why did you do that?
I'm not talking about that.
Well, did you do it?
I'm not talking about that at all.
Well, one victim told us that you drove him to attempt suicide. Do you have any regrets for that?
I'm not talking about this. I'm sorry,
Don't the victims deserve to hear why you did it?
How did you know I was here?
Don't the victims deserve to know why you did it?
I'm not talking about what we did at all.
What about Mark Stibbe? What about Richard Gittings? All these people, they've spoken to us, they respected you, they looked up to you. Do you think what you did was Christian?
I'm not answering any questions.
That investigation by Channel 4 followed the release of a report on Smythe in 2016. Despite having been written by two Church of England reverends in 1982, that report was withheld from the public for 34 years. Now, in that report, Smythe was found to have beaten two boys with more than 8,000 lashes each. On another occasion, 8 boys received 14,000 lashes between them. In 2017, the then Bishop of Guildford, Andrew Watson, came forward as a victim of Smythe's abuse.
I am one of the survivors of John Smythe's appalling activities in the late 1970s and early 80s. I'm also one of the bishops in the Church of England. This has placed me in a unique and challenging position when it comes to the events of the past few days. My own story is certainly less traumatic than that of some others. I was drawn into the Smythe circle as they were, and the beating I endured in the infamous garden shed was violent, excruciating, and shocking. But it was thankfully a one-off experience, never to be repeated.
Despite the church having a report into Smythe's abuse, he wasn't disciplined or handed over to the authorities. Instead, he was sent to Zimbabwe, where he ran Christian holiday camps. Reports of abuse began to pile up there too, including accusations that boys at the camp were forbidden from wearing underwear and faced beatings if they didn't comply. Smythe was also said to have stood naked in the shower area while the boys washed and to have led prayer sessions in the nude. And in 1992, a 16-year-old boy was found dead at the bottom of a swimming pool in Smythe's summer camp. At that point, other boys came forward with the abuse they'd suffered at Smythe's hand, leading to his arrest by the Zimbabwean police for culpable homicide. Now, that case collapsed. Smythe moved to South Africa, where he died in 2018. Now, a new independent report into Smythe released last week contains even more shocking allegations. In total, around 130 young men and boys across 3 countries are thought to have suffered traumatic physical, sexual, psychological, and spiritual attacks by Smythe. And the report found a systematic cover-up of Smythe's abuse by the Church of England. It also found it unlikely that the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, knew nothing about concerns raised about the serial abuser. Welby had known Smythe throughout the Christian camps that the abuser frequented. And while the report finds Welby didn't maintain contact with Smythe, it goes on to say this: Welby may not have known of the extreme seriousness of the abuse, but it is most probable that he would have had at least a level of knowledge that John Smythe was of some concern. It is not possible to establish whether Welby knew of the severity of the abuses in the UK prior to 2013. So they're saying it's ambiguous what was known prior to 2013. However, when Welby was made Archbishop of Canterbury in 2013, he certainly was made aware of Smythe's abuse, but apparently failed to alert the authorities in the UK or South Africa. And that's why now Welby is facing growing calls from within the Church of England to resign over the scandal. The Bishop of Newcastle, Helen Ann Hartley, has called for Welby to step down, and a petition by members of the Church's Parliament called the General Synod has gathered over 1,500 signatures. It says this: given his role in allowing abuse to continue, we believe that his continuing as the Archbishop of Canterbury is no longer tenable. We must see change for the sake of survivors, for the protection of the vulnerable, and for the good of the Church. And we share this determination across our traditions. With sadness, we do not think there is any alternative to his immediate resignation if the process of change and healing is to start now. Now, Welby has denied playing any part in a cover-up, but following Channel 4's investigation into Smythe, Welby said this in a 2019 interview with Channel 4 News.
I genuinely had no idea that there was anything as horrific as this going on. And the kind of story you showed on the clip, I mean, if I'd known that, I would have been very active, but I had no suspicions at all.
In an interview with Newman following the release of the Mackin report, Welby appears to have changed his tune.
When we spoke in 2019, after my investigation, you said, and just to quote back to you, you said, I genuinely had no idea that there was anything as horrific as this going on. If I'd known that, I'd have been very active, but I had no suspicions at all. I mean, no suspicions at all. You'd just been informed of the seriousness of John Smythe's abuse in 2013.
I was told there was an accusation of abuse, and this is where I went wrong. Safeguarding at that point had one person for the national part of the Church of England half-time. We're now around 40. And those are reforms I brought in myself. At that time, I asked the necessary questions, which was, I did right, which was to say, have the police been informed? Have social services been informed? I was told they had.
Here's what Welby said as well about the increasing calls for him to resign.
Will you resign?
I've been giving that a lot of thought for actually quite a long time. There's nothing over the last 10 years that has been as horrible as dealing with not just this one, but innumerable other abuse cases, as you will see from the ICSA inquiry and other things. I've given it a lot of thought. I've taken advice as recently as this morning from senior colleagues. And no, I'm not going to resign for this.
Now, Ash, I want your thoughts on this. I have to admit, I didn't follow this story in 2017, and it's sort of the background here that I find most shocking, that sort of the Church of England seems to have known this abuse was taking place, and then instead of doing anything to stop him, they advised him to leave the country, and then he went to Zimbabwe to continue his abuse. Like that's to me what's most shocking here. Obviously, the new information, why this is in the news today, is this new report which has suggested that Justin Welby knew more in 2013 than he had originally let on about. As far as I can tell, 2013, it seems like most of the abuse happened before then, but there could have been justice served before this man died. What's your response to how this has sort of become a big story again today?
So this has actually been a story that I've been following for a little while longer, and the reason why is because I was looking at it through the boarding school angle. So Smythe was working at Winchester College. That's where many of the victims attended, and one of the things that happened was that Winchester College banned him from the premises, but didn't inform the police. So what that suggests is that the school knew something about the allegations of abuse, but instead of informing the proper authorities, participated in something of a cover-up. Right, that's what that looks like. There'd been an inquiry, a report into the holiday camps as early as 1982. Again, that had been covered up. So in this way, the Church of England it's not unique. In fact, it's part of multiple institutions which, the technical term for this is failed in its safeguarding duties, but the real term of it is failed to bring a child abuser to justice when they could have done it. And what it seems to me to be the case, particularly with Winchester College, is that that's a boarding school which charges exorbitant fees. It's a business. They have to look after their commercial interests, which is to keep very rich people sending their children to this school. And so it's not preferable for someone to be held to account, to go to prison, for the details of the abuse to come to light, for the failures of the school in protecting their children, the children entrusted to their care to come to light. It's preferable to make the thing go away quietly, right? You can see how banning him from the premises, but not informing the police, how that logic works here. Now, obviously, what Justin Welby is claiming is that he did the right thing, which was ask if social services and police had been informed. I can't say whether that's true or not. What I can point to, the way you did, Michael, is that his story changed. It went from I had no suspicions to, well, actually I'd been informed, but we had a chronically understaffed safeguarding team, and actually I did the right thing. Now, there's a leap there. I wonder if there is another leap, and that other leap is, in fact, that maybe he didn't double check to make sure that the authorities had been informed. But once more, I think you can see an institution trying to protect itself rather than dealing with the problem of child abuse. Now, the reason why the story is coming to light in the way that it is, you can see that the Telegraph is going big on it. In part, it's because it's a huge story. It's a huge story if the Archbishop of Canterbury covered up for, a prolific and brutal abuser of children. I don't want to make too big a point of this, but the Telegraph has had it out for Justin Welby for a while because Justin Welby and the Church of England were quite staunch critics of the Rwanda scheme, anti-asylum discourses, and there was this idea that the Church of England had been interfering in politics in such a way that was detrimental to the interests of the Conservative Party. Now, the fact is that regardless of whether or not the Telegraph have a political interest in going for Justin Welby, that doesn't matter. The thing that really matters is whether or not Justin Welby did, as he is now saying that he did, which was the right thing in terms of informing the authorities. Because if he didn't, and this prolific child abuser was able to die without ever facing justice, that is, it's criminal. It's utterly criminal. It's beyond a dereliction of duty at that point. It's a gross. It is to participate in the abuse in terms of denying survivors access to justice. Like, it really, really is a terrible thing.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. I mean, I know you said sort of that it's clear what happened with the boarding school, which is they were protecting their business interests. No one wants sort of the idea, one of our staff members was an abuser, so they sort of prefer to just silently push them out. I assume you can apply a very similar logic to the church, right? Not necessarily a financial logic, but a logic where they say it's better for our image that this sort of goes away quietly without really coming to light. And in the sort of the most grim example of that was when he was still active, sort of saying, just go to Africa and do your abuse there. That's the thing that I find most sickening here. And then it seems with Welby, the accusation being made is that sort of he said it'd be better if justice wasn't done, because if justice is done, then it would be a big PR disaster for the church. Now, I'm sure he's denying that was his logic, of course, but that's the discussion that will be going on right now. On Friday's show, we talked about how inflation is being widely blamed for Donald Trump's victory over Kamala Harris, and we discussed how this has sparked a debate among liberal economists. So on the centrist side, we showed you Noah Smith. He argued that because Americans hate inflation more than they hate unemployment, Biden's economic policy should have been less progressive. So he blames inflation on too much spending by the Biden administration and thinks Harris's defeat shows it should have been pared back. And from the progressive wing of economics, or the economics profession, I showed you the commentary of Isabella Weber, who is professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts. She tweeted this: "Yes, inflation decided this election, as many progressive economists have warned since 2021. No, inflation was not due to too much government spending. It was induced by global shocks." Weber came to global prominence in 2021, arguing that inflation was caused in part by corporations taking advantage of global shocks to increase their profit rates. In response, she proposed what she called strategic price controls. Weber was pilloried at the time by leading figures in the economic establishment. But less than 2 years later, the IMF published a report which blamed 45% of inflation on excess profit. So she was somewhat vindicated then. Now, if you watched Friday's show, you might be asking, why are you telling me about Isabella Weber all over again? Well, the answer is simple. She agreed to be interviewed on the show today. I spoke to Weber earlier, and I asked her if Harris's loss means she feels vindicated.
I do feel vindicated, but I really wish I wasn't. I think that the re-election of Trump is really terrible news, not just for the US, but for the world. It was unfortunately quite clear that inflation will play a major role for anyone who has studied the history of inflation a little bit, as I happen to have done for how China escaped shock therapy. And we see very clearly that when prices spike up, especially when prices of essentials spike up, that this does something to people and that this can destabilize political systems and governments. And unfortunately, that's what we have seen now.
And, I think at this point, sort of everyone agrees that inflation really damaged Joe Biden, really damaged Kamala Harris, and did to some degree lay the ground for Donald Trump. And, most right-thinking people, I don't want to sound like a liberal elitist, but, lots of people around the world, probably most people in the economics establishment, think that's a bad thing. I suppose I wonder if any policy intervention could have had enough of an impact on inflation to really make a difference. And the reason I say that is because here in the UK, the government did actually really get involved in prices to some degree, right? So they spent £51 billion in total on subsidising energy bills. In part, that was by putting a windfall tax on the super profits made by the oil and gas companies who were profiting from that sort of inflation spike after the invasion of Ukraine. And obviously, Rishi Sunak still lost so catastrophically. So even if Biden had, been able to perfectly implement a bunch of policies which say cut inflation by a half or a third, would he still not have been punished for it, right? Because people don't necessarily sort of reward people for making inflation lower than it would have otherwise been. They just say, well, prices are higher than they were under the last guy, you're out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one important price that I actually haven't touched upon yet is, of course, the price of housing and rents. As most economies have relied very heavily on interest rate hikes, the cost of housing has increased. People have been pushed off the housing ladder who would have otherwise managed to go on the housing ladder, which has often meant that the demand for rental housing has gone up and rent prices have been going up, while housing prices have been going up together with mortgage rates. So that an already looming housing crisis was exacerbated not only by inflation, but also by interest rate hikes. So yes, European governments have done some of these things. The only government that I'm aware of that has done a pretty comprehensive package is actually Spain. So they did something on housing, they did something on grocery prices, they did something on power prices, on energy prices, on public transportation prices, on banking windfall profits. We did see that in the snap election that Sanchez called for, he actually did manage to defeat the far right. It wasn't in 2024, and the spectacular data that we have seen of every government basically being voted out in 2024. There might be something about the timeline here, but in any case, it is an example of, I think, how a government managed to maintain under extremely difficult circumstances a higher degree of political support than what we have seen in the US. I will also say that, Biden got some things right? The stimulus was absolutely correct. The revival of industrial policy, I think, was overdue. We have seen strong growth. We have seen strong employment. I don't know the latest UK data from the top of my head, but looking at Germany, which is a country that I follow very closely, the macroeconomic outcomes of Bidenomics have diverged very drastically from the macroeconomic situation that Germany is in, where we have had 2 years of recession, where we actually have had prolonged declines, and real wages now have started to pick up, but are still way below the pre-pandemic trend. But in any case, the point being that Biden did get a lot of the things right that many European countries did not get right. So if he had also gotten inflation right, I think he might have been in a stronger position than many of the European comparator countries that we might bring into the discussion.
And let's talk about Germany, because they have elections coming up. Scholz has just collapsed the coalition government. All the incumbents, I think, there are sort of incredibly unpopular. All incumbents at the moment are quite unpopular. They seem to be even more unpopular than usual. And one party that might benefit from this is the AfD, so the Alternative for Deutschland, a very far right party. Some describe them as neo-Nazi. This is really sort of seriously worrying. I know in response to this, you've tweeted that we need to start talking about an anti-fascist economics. So could I get you to sort of talk about what an anti-fascist economics might look like and how that might relate to the situation we're seeing in Germany?
So what I tweeted was actually that we need to have a serious conversation about anti-fascist economics, right? So it's not like I have the final plan in my drawer and I've been waiting to roll it out at the moment that Trump is elected or something like that. But I think we need to think very seriously about how we can do economic policies in ways that protects people's essential needs, that actually caters to the things that people really need, that prevents economic hardship, and that doesn't take a stance that says, oh, inflation is transitory and we can just wait for inflation to pass and then it will be fine because eventually prices are coming down again. No, in the meantime, people are suffering, and that kind of suffering translates into extremely dangerous kind of political dynamics. I think part of the story that we have with inflation is a story of fear, where people feel like they have been doing their part of the social contract. They have been showing up to work. They have been doing their job. And then the prices of the stuff that they cannot do without have been exploding in ways that really undermine their standard of living, which I think creates a sense of fear and undermines the trust in the economic system. So if this is the example that we talk about, then an anti-fascist kind of economic policy would take that danger of creating an atmosphere of fear very seriously and would try to prevent that kind of hardship, even if it means going up against certain efficiency roles, even if it means going up against certain ideas around what interventionism should not be doing. So in a word, I think we need a different criteria in thinking about economic policy. It can not only be optimal in an economic sense, but we also need to optimize, if you want so, for preventing economic hardships, for securing economic security. this, I think, also really applies to the question of a green transition, where if we rely in a green transition on CO2 prices alone, or we rely on a combination of CO2 prices and regulation, meaning we rely on making stuff more expensive and telling people what not to do, that makes it a very hard sell and contributes to this atmosphere of fear that we are already in. So I think in designing green transition policies, we have to think about how green transition policies can make the lived experience of ordinary people better, rather than making them feel like this is undermining their accustomed way of living, which is something that we just haven't done systematically, and which I think is a really, really urgent task. So these are just two areas as examples. Of course, clearly talking about the German example, austerity is poison in this kind of situation. There's a lot of historical research, from narrative history by historians to econometric studies from economists, that shows that austerity contributes to the rise of the far right. The kind of pretty severe austerity that we have experienced in Germany in recent years, in that context, is really a tremendous problem, and would certainly be not consistent with an anti-fascist kind of economic policy. So using that language is also about calling on Democrats in Germany, and here Democrats not in the sense of members of the Democratic Party, but in the sense of Democrats, members of communities and of parties that consider themselves in support of democracy, that it's really 5 to midnight to start thinking about how we can create an economic policy that doesn't push people into the arms of the far right, that doesn't create this massive opening for the far right to exploit those fears with all the fear mongering around migration, xenophobia, and so on.
That was Isabella Weber speaking to me earlier today. Really, really interesting thinker. I was sort of following the debate about how the Biden administration should deal with inflation at the time as well. The big people discussing it were basically the sort of more neoliberal economists, people like Larry Summers, saying what you need to do is you need to raise interest rates to create a bit more unemployment, because that will bring down inflation. So essentially you need to take some demand out of the economy. You know, they would admit, yes, this will cause more unemployment, but it's worth it because it will bring inflation down. On the other side, you had people like Adam Tooze, who we have on this show a fair amount, someone I listen to a lot. He was team transitionary, so he was saying you don't need to deflate the economy because this is ultimately going to pass. This is due to supply shocks. Inflation will come down. And he was right. Inflation did come down. The point that Isabella Weber's making is that even if inflation ultimately comes down, what damage will have been done by then, especially to the politics of a country? And as she's saying, it is the case, it seems to be the case, that inflation is, more than many other economic phenomena, something that can lead people to the far right. So even if Biden had, actually, I think lots of economists seem to say Biden's economics, even progressive ones, was quite good, right? The industrial policy was fine. It was good that he ran the economy hot because it did compress wages at the bottom, and ultimately inflation came down. But unless you think seriously about how pissed off people are going to be in the meantime, it's not a very good long-run strategy if you've got an election in 3 years' time. And that's one of the reasons why we have the return of Donald Trump. There is nothing like defeat to draw out all the contradictions in any coalition. And at the moment, the US Democrats are having a big old barney about whether the rise of woke has damaged the party's brand. And because America is the West's sole superpower, that means what happens there has an impact on discourse here, as was apparent on a recent episode of The Rest is Politics.
I remember talking to Jamie Rubin, who we also interviewed on Leading a while back, who's a very good friend of mine. I've talked to him a lot over the recent times. And he's always been saying to me, you guys don't get just how big this woke thing is. You think you've got it big, but you haven't got it nearly as big as it's happening in our country at the moment. So when we talk about them putting, as Peter Hyman did, about $25 million in advertising on trans, Trump talking about kids going in for as boys in the morning and coming back as girls in the afternoon, the dressing room stuff, all that. I think we underestimated how much that was getting through to people. And finally, Roy, the point that Nigel Farage made to me, he was totally blunt about it when we spoke on whatever day it was, the other day, Wednesday. He said, look, you guys may not like it, but in a world of turmoil, young men want an alpha male leader.
So Alistair Campbell there mentioned Jamie Rubin. He's a diplomat and a journalist. He's married to CNN's Christiane Amanpour. He also mentioned the Republicans putting millions of dollars behind ads associating Harris with trans rights. Now, one of those ads was this.
Kamala supports taxpayer-funded sex changes for prisoners.
Surgery.
For prisoners.
For prisoners. Every transgender inmate in the prison system would have access.
It's hard to believe, but it's true. Even the liberal media was shocked Kamala supports taxpayer-funded sex changes for prisoners and illegal aliens.
Every transgender inmate would have access.
Kamala's for they, them. President Trump is for you.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Now, I think that was a transphobic advert, right? Especially, I think, because of the inclusion of Rachel Levine. She's Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services. She's doing her job, but happens to be trans, so appears in a bunch of Republican attack ads. I think that's, a horrific thing to do. There is, though, some evidence that suggests these talking points did, to some degree, cut through with voters. Blueprint is a new public opinion research initiative launched to look at what Democrats need to do to win in 2024. They polled over 3,000 people and came to this conclusion. The results paint a clear picture. Democrats were punished for inflation, misalignment on immigration and cultural issues, and Biden. The top three reasons not to vote for Harris were inflation was too high under the Biden-Harris administration, too many immigrants illegally crossed the border under the Biden-Harris administration, and Kamala Harris is focused more on cultural issues like transgender issues rather than helping the middle class. They say this suggests that Harris was weighed down heavily by the Biden administration, particularly by inflation and their track record on immigration. Harris was also weighed down by voters' belief she focused on liberal cultural issues. In fact, this was the most frequent criticism among swing voters who broke for Trump. Now, I never think we should take these polls as gospel. They're often conducted by people with a bit of an agenda. This is saying, how can we make the Democrats electable in 2024? I'm guessing, they already had a bit of a bias against issues such as this. But some of the pushback against this talking point hasn't landed that well. This moment on CNN went viral over the weekend.
There are a lot of families out there who don't believe boys should play girls' sports.
They're not boys. I'm not going to listen to transphobia at this table. I am not going to listen to you call a trans girl a boy.
Are you going to allow me to finish my explanation?
When you use a word that's a slur, I'm going to interrupt. That's not how it is. They're not boys. They're not boys. They're not playing girls' softball. I'm not going to sit there and listen to that.
Let's reset for a second because, look, this is a really heated issue, right? And Sharmichael, I know you. I know that you understand that people have different views on this. I think out of respect for Jay, let's try to talk about this in a way that is respectful.
Okay, so let me rephrase this since I'm being targeted here.
I don't, just to be clear, you are not being targeted.
I am, but it's okay.
I'm specifically saying that I know that you are not intending to be transphobic.
He should know that I'm not intending. He wants to sit here and bloviate.
I want to give you an opportunity.
So the way regular people interpret it,
that's not regular people. That's not regular people. There's no consensus that these are actually boys. This whole thing about trans girls is a canard. We're talking about a tiny, tiny sliver of the population.
That may be the
and we're
case,
using
but
that
my point in
to
terms
take away
of its
healthcare from thousands of people.
Hold on, just get to your point.
My point in terms of its effectiveness. Regular people with children look at these things and they say, you know what? This is a bit too far. I do not agree with this. I don't like this. I think Democrats are going way too much to the left on social issues. They're uncomfortable with it. A lot of people believe that. A lot of families believe that. You may disagree with that reality, but that's why Republicans kept running those ads over and over and over again, because they saw the metrics suggested that they were working.
In those ads over and over again and using rhetoric like you just used, saying this is boys playing girls sports.
Well,
first of all, we're talking about 5 people in the entire country. We're talking about trans girls being allowed to play with the people who are in their gender. And if you don't believe, you don't have to listen to me. Listen to the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association.
The American Medical Association.
This is not about the
guys.
That clip has been viewed about 10 million times on Twitter. Now, Ash, I was in two minds about whether to sort of have this discussion on tonight's show, because I do feel conflicted. On the one hand, a president has just been elected who is transphobic, and I think lots of trans people will be sort of shocked and very offended that has happened, and I think they're absolutely right to. I also think that in that context, it's a bit much to then have all these sort of Democratic strategists saying, oh, and by the way, we lost the election because of you guys, which they didn't, right? I think the Democrats lost the election because of inflation. At the same time, there are ways that people on the left talk about some of these issues, and talk about some of these issues, which probably does leave sort of a mainstream political party detached from the public. And that's a dangerous place to be if you don't want to lose elections to right-wing populists. And I feel like you're a nuanced enough thinker that it was sort of worth introducing this story and these topics. So I'll hand over to you for your thoughts on this.
I think the first thing that it's really important to say is that the right understand how to operate within a culture of distraction. So what they're able to do is attack marginalized groups, and you can choose whatever group you want. Right? It might be saying really sexist things about women who don't have children. It might be attacking transgender people or non-binary people. It might be demonizing asylum seekers. And one of the things that they're able to do is launch these broadsides targeting a minority, right? So they can always bank on the idea that it's not going to be alienating to a majority of people, and certainly won't be perceived as an attack on swing voters. They can launch these attacks, and then the left and liberals, progressives generally, will leap to the defense of these minorities. Now, that is a good thing to do. I'm not saying that it is morally the wrong thing to do at all. What I'm saying is that the flip side of that is that every time you leap to the defense of a minority, you are more and more associated with minority groups rather than majority interests. And I think that there are ways to mitigate against that. The first thing, and this is really striking when you think about a politician like Bernie Sanders. Now, I do not think that Bernie Sanders is beyond reproach, right? There are lots of things, particularly his position on the genocide, which I disagree with. But Bernie Sanders is an example of someone who puts class at the forefront of every discussion he's having. So if he was asked about something like transgender people or pronouns or sports or whatever, you bet within 5 to 10 seconds, he'd bring it back to the economic pressures on everyday Americans. And he would do it in an inclusive way. He would say, well, transgender people have got to buy the same eggs that you do, or trans people are workers who are experiencing a historic robbery by the billionaire class. He would be connecting these minority groups back into a story that involves lots of different kinds of other people. In fact, affects the majority of people. And that's something which the likes of, Kamala Harris, that they can't do. Why? Because they're establishment Democrats. They are more comfortable talking about certain kinds of identity over class, and they can't bring it back into okay, well, everybody needs price controls. And that's, I think, part of how these issues to do with minority identity, how they can become so separate from the idea of majority interest. I don't think it's necessarily the case that in order to, for the left to win, that we have to roll over for transphobia or xenophobia or whatever else it is. I think there just has to be an awareness about bringing it back to things that everybody experiences, because you can never win a project based on either the electorate or some kind of mass mobilization by just appealing to minority identity groups. By definition, they are smaller numbers of people. You are not going to win. So that's the first thing, which is the lack of ability to bring it back to something which everybody experiences. I think the second thing, and this is the bit which I want to be cautious maybe about how I say it, is that I do think that the left has created in some ways a dysfunctional political culture, and then we've held it up as a virtue, and then when it comes back to bite us in the arse, we're like, oh my god, how did this happen? So one is, I think, an extreme intolerance of people using different kinds of language. And the fact is that most people out there don't think about trans issues or gender identity very much. The language that they use is going to be very different. How they frame the issue in their heads is going to be different from people who, either are trans or non-binary or are, activists like within those causes. It's going to be very different. And if you end up in a situation where someone uses the wrong language and they're immediately being shouted at, I understand, like, I'm a woman of color, right? I am a Muslim woman of color. I understand how important language is. But if you create these sort of conversational tripwires where every time someone trips over one, they're met with something which is, angry or hostile, you're just pushing people away. And one of the problems is that happens on TV a lot, and that shapes people's perceptions of what this entire community is like. Now, that is not what most people are like in real life, but that's a problem if that's got heightened visibility. Now, part of the reason why it's got heightened visibility is that the media loves transphobia. They love fights about trans rights, and it's so hard to both contest that space and do it in a way which is winning over persuadables. But that's the challenge. That's the thing that's got to be done. And I think that part of how that can be done, and again, I'm speaking as a cisgender heterosexual person, all right? Like I can't say, well, this is me speaking for trans people. This is me just speaking from an experience of contesting media and thinking about what has been persuasive versus what hasn't. And I've fucked up an awful lot of times. Is that rooting things in universalist values, I think, is always more persuasive. The minute you make it about, what you have to do for me, the things you've got to change about what you do for me, like, you are always at risk of losing people. Whereas I think if you were to explain what it's like to be trans by saying to a cisgender person, okay, you know yourself to be a woman or a man or whatever it is, you know yourself to be a woman. That is who you know yourself to be. Like, deep in the marrow of your bones, you know this about yourself. Now, imagine if the rest of the world was saying you can't be that. You can't be in the spaces which match your gender. We're not going to let you change things about your body or your presentation. Imagine if that was the world that you lived in, because that's the world that trans people live in, right? When they live in contexts where they are denied access to gender affirming treatment or being denied access to the spaces which match their gender. And I think rather than rooting it in this thing of like, okay, well, here's this minority telling us what to do and how to think and how to talk, you're rooting it in a sense of shared humanity. I just think that's almost always the way forward when you are contesting social and cultural norms from a minority position. The thing that I come down to, and I wonder what you think about this, Michael, is that, like, the thing which depresses me is that trans people get reduced to being an issue rather than being people. They're not just talking points, but the thing that happens, particularly within media, is that the conversation becomes completely decoupled from the humanity of the people that the conversation is about. And I think that the liberal left and progressives have participated in that to some degree. And I think that has been to the detriment of the trans rights cause.
I agree with everything you said. And as I say, sort of, when I was saying you're nuanced enough to sort of tackle this issue, I wasn't comparing you to other co-hosts. I was comparing you to myself, really, which is to say I wouldn't feel confident enough sort of to tackle this in the way that you did. I suppose where I come on this is I think there was an attempt on the progressive wing to change policy in quite a concrete way, or to change norms in quite a concrete way without having an argument about it. So there were sort of many positions which the general public don't agree with, surrounding sports, surrounding prisons, et cetera, if you poll them. And if you have a position where it's taboo to talk about that, then you're not going to do very well in an election, right? Because you've said you haven't been willing to have those debates, but at the same time, everyone disagrees with you. I feel like it makes sense to shut down a debate, maybe if you're winning it, but if you're not yet winning it and then you try and shut it down, it's not necessarily going to go very well when the election comes about.
I think there's truth in that. And I understand why. I understand why trans people, and in particular trans women who experienced just some of the most, again, speaking as a Muslim who grew up during the war on terror, I think that the levels of hostility that trans women experience, particularly in the media, I think that's comparable. I can really understand going, I am not going to participate in this. I am not going to put my life, my existence, up to be an object of ridicule and to become a hate figure. I can really, really understand that. The problem is that those spaces were being contested with or without you. And then what got lost, because trans people completely understandably said, we're not going to participate in this, was the humanity of trans people. And again, like what the median experience for a trans person is. I mean, one of the things that the discussions within the media focus on, I guess, are these kind of edge cases, right? Like most trans people aren't prison inmates, and yet we're hyper focused on that. Whereas for the realities for most trans people and the world that they're navigating, it's not what prison cell are they going to be in, right? It's different. So again, it's like focusing on like the minority of a minority, which I think is another way in which the median voter gets lost. Now, I know that there are trans people, trans journalists, Sean Fay being one of them, who's really like tried to emphasize the sort of the material conditions that trans people experience and how those are shared with other people, and also tried to emphasize this is actually what we're going through, right? This is where the discussion is. This is what we're going through, and I think that's important work to do. I think that one of the problems is that work is being done in spaces where maybe your persuadables aren't. So it's happening within more friendly spaces rather than the really, really hostile ones. I understand why. I understand why that is. I think tactically, maybe that's a mistake.
If you've been anywhere near social media this weekend, you're likely one of the thousands who witnessed mainstream media and politicians gaslighting us all in real time. The subject was an outbreak of hooliganism in Amsterdam, prompted by the racist fans of Maccabi Tel Aviv. That racist violence was met with violence from locals, some of it admittedly racist. But, and this is where the gaslighting comes in, that two-way mob violence was, after the fact, redesignated a racist pogrom. These were just some of the headlines from international media describing the events. The New York Times described the clashes as anti-Semitic attacks. In The Telegraph, columnist Brendan O'Neill referred to the clashes as pogroms, having returned to Europe. And while they didn't label the clashes anti-Semitic, even The Guardian cast the Israeli football fans as the victims. Politicians were even quicker to characterize events as brazenly anti-Semitic. British Foreign Secretary David Lammy said he was horrified by the anti-Semitic attacks, or what he called anti-Semitic attacks. Joe Biden also called the clashes anti-Semitic, while linking them with the historic persecution of Jews in Europe. Meanwhile, King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands connected the skirmishes to the Holocaust, saying this: "We failed the Jewish community of the Netherlands during World War II, and last night we failed again." Sky News, though, at first at least, had a more balanced take.
Violence in Amsterdam left at least 5 people injured and dozens have been arrested. But what happened? Supporters of Israeli football club Maccabi Tel Aviv arrived in Amsterdam ahead of their UEFA Europa League match against Amsterdam club Ajax. On Wednesday, social media videos verified by Sky News show Maccabi Tel Aviv fans tearing down Palestinian flags from outside of homes. Other social media videos appeared to show residents chasing Maccabi Tel Aviv fans. On Thursday, just before the game, crowds of Maccabi fans were filmed singing racist and anti-Arab songs. While a pro-Palestinian demonstration had been banned by the mayor over fears there would be clashes. Later that evening during the match, Israeli supporters appeared to disrupt the minute silence for Valencia flood victims with chants, whistles and fireworks. Maccabi fans were seen attacking locals as a police car can be seen driving by. People with Palestinian flags were seen marching on the streets. Maccabi supporters say they were beaten and attacked on the streets of the Dutch capital, with videos showing some of the violence.
Say free Palestine and we go. Good.
Sky News could not independently verify all of the footage shown. Police arrested 62 people. 5 were taken to hospital, but have since been discharged. Israeli far-right ultras are notorious for their racism and physical violence. Dutch, Israeli and British leaders denounced the attacks as anti-Semitic and even referred to it as a pogrom. But their statements failed to mention the assaults by the Israeli hooligans against Dutch citizens.
So according to that report, before any violence broke out after that football match on Thursday night, Israeli fans had torn down Palestinian flags, disrupted a minute's silence at the march, and chanted racist songs about Arabs. It's worth noting that one line from that chant not shown on TV was this: "Ole, ole, ole, why is school out in Gaza? There are no children left there." Right, so that's what they were chanting. The report also shows that after the match, gangs of Israeli fans attacked locals in the city, and it pointed out the presence of far-right Israeli ultras among the fans. And it noted that political leaders condemned the attacks on Israeli fans as anti-Semitic without mentioning the assaults by Israelis on Dutch citizens. It turns out, though, that report we just showed you from Sky News was in fact too balanced, and it was quickly deleted and replaced with a new one. The original report is on the left, the new one is on the right, and in the new version, the violence in Amsterdam is immediately framed as anti-Semitic. The new report also had a different opening, setting up the narrative of Israeli victimhood right from the start.
Violence in Amsterdam left at least 5 people injured and dozens have been arrested. But what happened?
Everything should be done to track down and prosecute the perpetrators. This is simply anti-Semitic violence against Israelis that actually defies description.
That was Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof describing the scenes in Amsterdam as anti-Semitic before the audience has even seen them. They haven't seen the scenes yet in that package. There are other changes too. Added to the new report was this interview with a Maccabi fan.
It's the same feeling that I felt in the morning of the 7th of October.
Now, no interviews with Dutch locals were added to that report. And remember the scene reporting Maccabi fans attacking locals after the match? Well, that was replaced with this.
A video posted on social media shows a large group of hooded men dressed in black running down the street and striking people at random.
So it's no longer Maccabi hooligans doing the attacks, but unidentifiable hooded men. Now, that footage was filmed by Dutch photojournalist Annette de Graaf, who has complained about her video being misused by mainstream media. This is how she says it should be reported. Write down, Maccabi supporters attacked Amsterdam citizens in front of Central Station after the game. She also has asked for media outlets to remove her footage and apologise because they are sort of misrepresenting it as the fans being attacked, not the fans doing the attacking. De Graaf's footage also appears to have been manipulated on BBC Newsnight during an interview with Maccabi supporter Ami Schumann.
No police, no one to take care of us because they didn't know what is going to happen. And suddenly a lot of people come to attack us. A lot of people, like 100, maybe more, with belts and sticks and rock. And they took everything that they can to beat Israeli and Jews.
So that was BBC Newsnight playing video of Israeli football fans attacking locals to illustrate a story in which the hooligans are cast as the victims. Right? So the person who filmed that footage said they were the Israeli football fans. If you're going to use that footage, you better be honest or take it down and apologise. I don't think the BBC have. Teenage journalist Ome Bender was also at the scene, following the crowd of Maccabi fans from the football stadium until they were intercepted by the police. His footage also tells a very different story from how our media reported the clashes.
We lopen er nu recht achter. Oké, ze sluiten hun in. Ze worden een soort van ingesloten, zodat we niet de dam op kunnen. Maar we zitten in principe nu wel echt in het centrum. Dus we staan weer op stilstand. Ik denk dat ze daarheen gaan. Ik vind, het ziet er levensgevaarlijk uit. Ze staan met ijzeren pijpen, stokken. Alle harde dingen die op knuppels lijken hebben ze op straat gevonden. Lopen ze gewoon mee te patrouilleren. En alles wat ze niet bevalt gaat eraan. Dit wordt nog wat. Er is een soort team. Een soort teamoverleg. Leader of the bunch is er. Ze hebben gewoon kinderen, ik denk nog geen 12 jaar oud, lopen met stokken door de kleine straatjes voorop.
Bender also caught this threatening moment.
Zo, ik moest ook net stoppen met filmen. Ze zeiden, voor je eigen veiligheid zet nu je mic uit. Maar ze zijn niet blij.
Media. No. We're media. Okay. So stop. For you. For yourself.
Wow. So that's a Maccabi fan, so a fan that's come over from Israel, telling that Dutch guy with a camera, stop filming for your own safety, right? And these are the people being cast as the victims by the Western media. Ofer Kassif is a left-wing member of the Knesset, and that's Israel's parliament, of course. Here's how he described Israeli media distortions of the clashes in Amsterdam. The spirit of Israeli fascism has reached Amsterdam. Fans go on a violent rampage, beating, tearing up Palestinian flags in the streets as if they were an occupying force and shouting Nazi slogans in favor of the extermination of a nation, and whining when the situation degenerates into complete chaos and violence returns to them like a boomerang. Any violence is obscene and unacceptable. Both sides should be held accountable for their hooliganism, and the Israeli media, as usual, approaches, hides, and distorts reality in the service of the authorities. Now, he's talking about the Israeli media. We can equally talk about the Western media in this situation. Following the skirmishes in Amsterdam, the Israeli government has now issued this warning to its citizens. Israel warns of attacks across Europe and urges citizens to stay away from large events. But on their way home from Amsterdam on special evacuation flights arranged by the Israeli government, Maccabi fans didn't seem too upset. Ash, how did a rampage by a group of racist football ultras end up with a bunch of headlines saying this was a pogrom in Europe comparable to the Holocaust?
Israel really is the most extraordinary country on the planet, right? Credit where credit's due. I didn't think that they would be able to get the entirety of the Western media establishment to come out in support of football hooliganism. But they've done it. They've somehow done it. They've achieved the impossible. I mean, mashallah, phenomenal work. I mean, it's just gaslighting, right? It's just gaslighting. And the thing is that anyone who knows even the slightest thing about football culture would be able to tell you that, you know, this behavior by Israeli football fans, Maccabi Tel Aviv fans, it's not unheard of when it comes to football away days, all right? Like, football culture always reflects some aspect of political culture, right? Like, whether it's like, Celtic v Rangers, or, whether it's, Red Star Belgrade, or like, football has always done this, all right? It's always reflected the political culture in some way. Now, Maccabi Tel Aviv has tended to reflect some of the most fascistic, right-wing, racist, misogynist elements of Israeli political culture. So a while ago, not recently, but on another away day, I believe it was in the Netherlands as well, you had a big group of Maccabi Tel Aviv fans singing one of their favorite songs, which accuses a rival Israeli team of being Arab fuckers, essentially, and says, we're going to get your girls who like to party, i.e. the girls from the country they've come to visit for a football match, we're going to rape them. All right. That is one of their songs. It is one of the most egregiously obnoxious and violent, hooligan cultures in the world, I would say. Clearly what happened is that, like, they came to Amsterdam, they tore down Palestinian flags, they attacked locals, and after starting a fight in a city, locals responded with violence. I'm not saying that that's the right thing to do, but I think it's an inevitable thing to happen when you've got, a bunch of foreign football hooligans coming and attacking your city, and violence was met with violence. This was a case of what in football parlance would be known as chat shit, get banged. But because you've got this context whereby anything that an Israeli is involved with, the Israeli state and its advocates internationally will try and turn it into a story about the persecution of Jewish people. Now, I've got no doubts that some of the people involved in that violence were probably anti-Semitic or said anti-Semitic things. I've got absolutely no doubt about that. I've also got no doubt that many of those responding with violence will have been motivated by the fact that these foreign football fans have come along and started trashing the city that they're visiting. Now, again, it's not unheard of for football fans to do that kind of thing. It's not unheard of for football fans to racially abuse people in the countries that they visit. We saw that with Chelsea supporters famously pushing a black guy off of a Paris metro. But what is unique is that then suddenly you've got this playing of the victim afterwards, right? You started a fight, you came off worse in it, and then suddenly you're being evacuated by your home country. You've got people comparing it to Kristallnacht, which is just gratuitously offensive, and you've got governments sort of clutching their pearls about it. One of the things that I think turns it into a story which goes this way is that it's not just about what the Israeli state says, is that you've got these organizations and institutions which claim to be speaking in the interests of Jewish people. Like you had a Holocaust Remembrance Institution. I can't remember the exact one. We had a Holocaust Remembrance Institution, saying that this was anti-Semitic violence and that this was a pogrom. These are well-respected institutions, in part because they're entrusted with being the custodians with one of the most painful parts of European history. And they weaponize that power to protect, in this case, racist, violent thugs. I mean, it's completely disgusting. And one of the things that I think happens because of it is that people can access this information, they can see what really happened. Is that I think that their ability to respond with empathy and understanding when it comes to anti-Semitism is diminished. I think that one of the effects of this weaponization of the language of anti-Semitism is to actually make anti-Semitism worse. I think that that's one of the downstream effects of it. But yeah, as someone who both feels passionately about the genocide that Israel is waging in Gaza, and also someone who's really into football, I looked at the news of the last few days and I was just like, what the fuck is going on? Sorry for swearing a lot. Some of it was my swearing, some of it was necessary swearing to convey the ugliness of some of these chants.
I mean, it is the president of the United States tweeting about it as well. Like, as you say, I'm sure some of the people who fought back were, unpleasant people who may have said racist things. But the story here is, you've got this group of football ultras that go to a foreign country. And as you say, it's not unusual. It's not exceptional to Israeli football fans, right? This happens. But they go there, they cause a ruckus, they say racist things. Obviously, Amsterdam has a large Arab population. They're going around shouting horrible racist things about Arabs. Like, you're going to get a response. And then within 24 hours, the president of the most powerful country in the world is tweeting, defending this bunch of hooligans. Right, so I can't think of, when people say you shouldn't talk about like Israeli exceptionalism, because it's tropey to say we treat Israel differently to how we treat other countries. But it is unusual to have the president of the United States tweeting in defense of a bunch of football thugs getting beaten up in a foreign city. Like, why is he even talking about this?
I half expect like the Chelsea headhunters or, inner-city firm next time to be like, right, next time, lads, we've got to get a head of state involved. All right, that's the level. I think it's, and this is the thing, which is sort of, unique here, is that it's not just being, violent racist thugs, of which there are many from many cultures, many countries. All right. It's being violent racist thugs from a country that is currently waging a genocide, and then going off like, rolling around on the ground, pretending that, your leg just got taken off in a sliding tackle. It's the combination of viciousness, racism, and then claiming victimhood, which is the thing which I think really drives people crazy. I think it drives me crazy. All right. One or the other. Pick a lane.
I suppose that is the traditional meaning of gaslighting, isn't it? Which is that someone's sort of lying to you when it's so obvious and it's making you feel crazy because that's what's being done to you. Ash, let's wrap up. It was an energizing story to end with, even if an infuriating one.
Why did you have to end on that story? Like, I'm now so pumped up and adrenalized.
You're not going to sleep now.
No, I'm going to have to go downstairs and do some yogic breathing.
Well, that sounds like a very healthy outlet for your frustration, Ash. People turn to much more dangerous and unhealthy outlets than yoga. So I have no concerns for your well-being, I have to say. I don't feel guilty at all that we ended on this story.
Ugh. Well, look, I didn't want to go downstairs and do the sort of single nostril breathing thing. I wanted to go downstairs and make dinner, but now that will be delayed. Thanks, Michael.
Ash, it's been a pleasure being joined by you. Thank you all for watching. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.